Right now, somewhere in America, the last person who ever tasted these desserts is forgetting what they were like. Not the names, the taste. There was a time you couldn't walk past a five and dime without one of these sitting in the window, turning slowly under a glass dome, catching the afternoon light. Then the menus changed, the recipe cards got thrown out, and the cooks passed away without writing anything down. When the last person who remembers them is gone, that's it. No photo brings them back. So before they disappear completely, let's save all 30, starting with number 30. Say prune whip to anyone under 60 today, and you'll get a laugh or a wrinkled nose. But in 1950, this was the dessert a tired waitress would slide in front of you when you said you wanted something light. It was nothing more than stewed prunes, beaten egg whites, and a little sugar, whipped until it stood up in soft peaks the color of dark amber. Cold, airy, faintly sweet, with that deep stewed fruit flavor underneath. It showed up everywhere: hospital trays, school cafeterias, and the lunch counters of every Woolworths and Kresge's in the country. It was cheap, it was easy, and in an era before everyone counted calories, it was considered the healthy choice on the dessert board. And that's exactly why it died. The moment America decided that prune was a punchline instead of a fruit, Prune Whip was finished. No diner wanted it on the menu. No kid would order it. By the late 60s, it had quietly slipped off the counter and into the kind of recipe box that gets thrown out when a house is cleared. Today, this one stops people in their tracks, and it should. A cake, a moist, spiced, reddish-brown layer cake, made with a can of condensed tomato soup poured right into the batter. It sounds like a mistake. It was a masterpiece. The tomato soup did something no one expected. It kept the cake impossibly moist for days. It gave the crumb a warm, reddish tint, and the acidity married perfectly with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. You couldn't taste tomato at all. What you tasted was something between a spice cake and a carrot cake, dense and fragrant, usually crowned with a thick swoop of cream cheese frosting. It was born out of necessity. During the lean years, when fresh fruit and extra eggs were luxuries, a can of soup off the shelf was how you made a cake out of almost nothing. The lunch counters kept serving it long after the hard times passed, because customers had grown to love it. It was the dessert that proved a good cook could turn anything into magic. But as Americans grew richer and more squeamish, the idea of soup in a cake became something to hide rather than celebrate. The recipe got embarrassing. Mothers stopped passing it down. And a cake that once fed a generation became a curiosity nobody under 70 even believes existed. If you've never had a slice, and you almost certainly haven't, you've missed something genuinely wonderful. Here's a word most people have never even heard out loud: blancmange. It's French for white food, and that's exactly what it was. A pale, trembling, molded pudding, set with cornstarch and sweetened, in the old days, with honey instead of sugar. It arrived at the counter cold and quivering, turned out of a fluted mold, so it stood on the plate like something carved from cream. The texture was the whole point. Smooth, silky, somewhere between custard and panna cotta, dissolving on the tongue with a faint floral sweetness from the honey. Sometimes it came plain, sometimes with a spoonful of stewed berries pooled around the base. Blancmange had been a staple of American and European tables for over 100 years. By the 1950s, it was the dessert you ordered when you wanted something elegant but gentle, refined without being rich. It carried a kind of old-world dignity to the chrome and formica world of the lunch counter. And that old-world dignity is precisely what doomed it. When instant Jell-O pudding hit shelves, same idea. No work, no mold, no skill. There was simply no reason to make a blancmange from scratch anymore. Why stand over a pot stirring cornstarch when a box did it in 5 minutes? The molds got pushed to the back of the cupboard. The word itself fell out of the language, and one of the most graceful desserts America ever served vanished so completely that today it sounds made up. There's a whole family of desserts that came straight out of the hard years and stubbornly survived into the boom, and boiled raisin cake is the proudest of them. The name confuses people. You don't boil the cake. You boil the raisins first, in water with sugar and spices, until they plump up and the liquid turns into a dark, sweet syrup. Then that whole fragrant mixture goes into the batter. The result was a dense, dark, deeply spiced cake, studded with soft raisins in every bite, moist, almost sticky, smelling of cinnamon and cloves the second it came out of the oven. It needed no frosting, it kept for a week, and it cost almost nothing to make, which is why it became a fixture on counters where every penny mattered. They called cakes like this war cakes or poor man's cakes, because they used no butter, no milk, and sometimes no eggs, all the things that were rationed or expensive. The boiled raisins did the work that richer ingredients couldn't afford to. But prosperity has a way of erasing the foods of hard times. As the 50s rolled into the 60s, and butter and eggs were cheap again, who wanted a poor man's cake? The very thing that made it special, its thrift, its ingenuity, became a reason to be ashamed of it. It slid off the menu, and the technique of boiling your raisins first went with it. A cake born from going without was finally undone.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
Long before pudding meant a cup of chocolate goo, it meant this: a dense, dark, steamed cake, packed with dried figs, turned out hot and glistening, and served with a pour of warm sauce. Steamed fig pudding was the dessert of cold afternoons, the thing that fogged up the counter windows while it cooked in its mold over a pot of simmering water. The figs gave it a deep, jammy sweetness and a texture full of tiny seeds that popped between your teeth. The steaming made it impossibly moist, nothing like a baked cake, almost like a warm, sliceable custard shot through with fruit. Over the top went a hard sauce or a hot vanilla sauce that melted down the sides the moment it hit the plate. It was a holdover from an older, English-rooted America, and it lingered at lunch counters well into the 50s because it was filling, warming, and beloved by an older generation who'd grown up on it. Its death was slow and quiet. Steaming a pudding takes an hour or more of attention, a luxury no busy counter could spare once the lunch rush sped up and convenience took over. Younger customers found it heavy, old-fashioned, strange. The molds were the first thing to go when kitchens modernized, and so a dessert that had been on American tables for 2 centuries simply stopped being made. Today, there's hardly a cook left who remembers how to turn one out of the mold without it falling apart. This is one of those desserts where the brand name became the dish. Grape nuts pudding was a baked custard, eggs, milk, sugar, vanilla, with a generous handful of grape nut cereal stirred in before it went into the oven. As it baked, something strange and wonderful happened. The cereal floated up and formed a crunchy, toasty crust on top, while what sank to the bottom went soft and chewy, soaking up the custard. So every spoonful gave you 3 textures at once: silky custard in the middle, crisp on top, tender and nubbly below. It tasted of warm vanilla and malt, dusted with a little nutmeg, and it came to the counter still warm from the oven in a thick white dish. It was New England's quiet pride, spreading out from there to lunch counters across the country. It was humble, cheap, made from a box of cereal off the shelf, and people adored it. Regulars would ask if it was a grape nuts day, the way you'd ask about a daily special. But a dessert built on one specific brand of cereal lives and dies by the cereal aisle. As tastes shifted and baked custards fell out of fashion, The pudding disappeared from menus first, then from cookbooks, then from memory. The cereal's still on the shelf. Almost nobody buys it to make pudding anymore. And a dish that defined dessert for a whole region of the country. Not every counter dessert was on a plate with a fork. Some sat in a glass jar by the register, and the king of that jar was the hermit. A hermit is a spice cookie, dark, soft, chewy, packed with raisins and sometimes walnuts, heavy with cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and molasses. They were usually baked in long bars and cut into squares, with slightly crisp edges and a yielding, almost cakey center. The legend says they earned the name because they keep so well. You could bake a batch, tuck them away like a hermit, and they'd taste even better days later as the spices deepened. That made them perfect counterfood. Bake them Monday, sell them all week, and they only improved. For sailors, school children, and working men grabbing something on the go, the hermit was the perfect handheld sweet, sturdy, satisfying, and gone in 3 bites. Every lunch counter and corner bakery had its own version, and regulars were loyal to theirs. What killed the hermit was the same thing that killed so much of this list: the factory. When packaged, shelf-stable cookies in cellophane took over America, why would a counter bother baking its own spice bars? The mass-produced cookie was cheaper, faster, and always the same. The homemade hermit, with its deep molasses soul and its slightly different character every batch, couldn't compete with a machine. The jar by the register emptied and was never refilled, and one of the oldest cookies in America faded into a name nobody recognizes. Before the apple crisp, before the apple crumble took over every dessert menu in the country, there was the Brown Betty, and at the lunch counter, she was royalty. Layers of spiced sliced apples and buttered breadcrumbs, baked together until the top went golden and crackly, and the inside turned into soft, cinnamon-soaked fruit. Served warm, often with a pour of cream or a melting scoop of vanilla. What made the Betty special was those breadcrumbs. Not flour, not oats. Actual crumbs from day-old bread, tossed in butter and sugar, layered through the apples so they soaked up all the juices and turned into something between a pudding and a crust. It was the original waste-nothing dessert. Stale bread and a few apples became a thing people drove across town for. It had been an American favorite since the 1800s, and it was still going strong on counters in the early 50s. Warm, comforting, cheap, and forgiving. You could make it from almost anything. But the Brown Betty had a younger, flashier cousin coming up fast, the apple crisp, with its oat and flour topping, and the apple crumble close behind. They were easier to make consistent, they looked neater on the plate, and they slowly pushed the old Betty aside. The breadcrumb method came to seem strange and old-fashioned. Why use bread when you could use a proper crumble? Bit by bit, the Betty was replaced by her own descendants, until the name itself became a riddle. Most people today have never even heard it. Plain rice pudding still exists, sort of, but not this. Not the lunch counter version that came to you in a tall-footed glass. The creamy pudding rising up the sides, and on top, arranged with real care, a ring of plump raisins set into the surface like jewels in a crown. That little crown of raisins was the signature. It told you this wasn't slop from a can. Somebody had plated this on purpose. The pudding itself was slow-cooked. Rice simmered patiently in milk and sugar until it went thick and creamy, scented with vanilla and a dusting of cinnamon or nutmeg across the top. Sometimes it was served warm, sometimes cold straight from the icebox, where it set up even denser and richer. It was the ultimate comfort dessert, the thing you ordered when the weather turned and you wanted to be taken care of. Cheap to make, endlessly satisfying, and a clever way to use up the morning's leftover rice, which is exactly how the counters could sell it for a nickel or a dime. The crown was the first casualty. As counters sped up and cut corners, nobody had time to arrange raisins one by one. Then the slow-cooked pudding itself gave way to instant mixes that set in minutes and tasted like a shadow of the real thing. The tall-footed glass disappeared into the dish bin, and the careful little raisin crown, that small daily act of pride, vanished so completely that most people don't believe it was ever there. Some people shudder at the memory, and some people would give anything for one more bowl. But everybody who lived through the 50s remembers tapioca pudding. Those little translucent pearls suspended in warm vanilla custard, each one tender and slightly chewy, with a texture unlike anything else on the dessert board. The kids who hated it called it fish eyes. The grown-ups who loved it called it perfect. Real tapioca pudding was a labor of patience. The pearls had to soak, then cook low and slow, stirred constantly so they didn't clump, until each one turned from chalky white to clear, and the whole pot thickened into something glossy and rich. Folded with beaten egg and vanilla at the end, it came to the counter warm, with a skin on top that the regulars either scraped off or savored. It was on every counter in America, a workhorse dessert, cheap, filling, comforting, and a little bit fascinating to look at. Children would push the pearls around with a spoon. Old men ate it for the same reason they had as boys. And then the box arrived. Instant tapioca, then instant everything. Promised the same dessert in a fraction of the time with none of the stirring. But the instant version never had the same chew, the same warmth, the same soul. Counters switched anyway, because speed was everything. The slow, hand-stirred pudding, the real thing, quietly went extinct. What's left in the grocery store today is a distant, hollow echo of what used to come across that counter warm. There's chocolate, and then there's the dessert chocolate never quite managed to kill. Real butterscotch pudding. Not the artificial, too-sweet stuff in a plastic cup today. The genuine article, made by cooking brown sugar and butter together until they turned dark and nutty and almost burnt, then building a custard around that deep, toffee-edged flavor. That's what butterscotch actually means. Scorched butter, sugar cooked to the edge of caramel. Done right, it gave the pudding a complexity that plain sweetness could never touch. Rich, warm, faintly smoky, with that grown-up bitterness underneath the sugar. It came to the counter in a little glass, cool and silky, sometimes with a soft cap of whipped cream, sometimes with the faintest skin on top. At the lunch counter, it was the sophisticated choice. The pudding adults ordered when the kids got chocolate. It paired with a cup of black coffee like it was made for it. And for a lot of regulars, that combination was dessert. What happened to it is the saddest kind of disappearance. It didn't vanish so much as get replaced by a fake. The instant mix and the pre-made plastic cup kept the name butterscotch, but threw out everything that made it worth eating. The cooked sugar, the real butter, the patience. A whole generation grew up thinking butterscotch is that flat, candy-sweet flavor from a cup. They've never tasted the real thing, and the cooks who knew how to scorch the butter just right took the secret with them. If butterscotch pudding was a dying art, burnt sugar cake was its grand, towering cousin, and it required real skill. The whole flavor came from one dramatic step: melting plain white sugar in a hot pan, alone, watching it turn from clear to gold to deep mahogany, right at the knife's edge before it scorched. That dark, bittersweet caramel syrup went into the batter and the frosting, perfuming the entire cake with a flavor you cannot get any other way. The result was a tall, tender layer cake the color of warm honey, with a caramel depth that was sweet and smoky and slightly bitter all at once, sophisticated in a way that surprised people who expected just cake. The frosting, made the same way, set up glossy and rich. It was a showpiece, the kind of cake a counter would put front and center under glass to draw people in off the sidewalk. Making it was the problem. That moment of melting the sugar is unforgiving. A few seconds too long and the whole thing turns acrid, and you start over. It took a cook who knew exactly what they were doing, by smell and by color, with no thermometer and no second chances. As skilled counter cooks retired and were replaced by faster, simpler operations, nobody had the time or the nerve to stand over a pan of melting sugar. Box mixes offered 100 easier flavors. The burnt sugar cake, the one that demanded a real baker, was simply too much trouble to keep alive, and so it didn't. In a world before refrigeration was everywhere, a cold, light, trembling dessert felt almost like magic, and lemon snow pudding was the most magical of all. It was made by whipping egg whites into a billowing cloud, then folding in a tart lemon gelatin base until the whole thing turned into a pale, glistening, snowy mound that quivered when you set it down. It came to the counter cool and ethereal, often sitting in a pool of soft, pale yellow custard sauce. The contrast was the whole experience: the airy, barely sweet, lemon-bright snow on top, and the rich, smooth custard underneath, light as a breath, sharp and refreshing. It was the dessert you ordered on a warm afternoon when anything heavier felt like too much. It carried a whisper of elegance, the kind of thing you'd find at a fine tea room as easily as a five-and-dime counter. Making it meant separating eggs, whipping whites by hand or with a hand-crank beater, making a custard from the yolks so nothing went to waste, and timing the gelatin just right. That was far too much work for a busy counter. Once the shortcuts arrived, flavored gelatin in a box could give you something lemony and cold in minutes. No whipping, no custard, no skill. It wasn't the same. It had none of the cloud-like lightness, none of the silky sauce, but it was fast, and fast won. The snow melted off the menu, and a dessert that once felt like a small miracle became something nobody's grandmother even thinks to mention anymore. This is one of the oldest desserts in America, older than the country itself, and the fact that it survived all the way to the 1950s lunch counter only makes its disappearance sadder. Indian pudding was cornmeal, slow-baked for hours in milk with molasses, butter, and warm spices, until it turned into a dark, soft, almost grainy pudding with a deep, earthy, bittersweet flavor all its own. The name came from the cornmeal, Indian meal, as the colonists called it. What came out of the oven hours later was humble and homely looking, a dim brown in a plain dish, but the taste was extraordinary. Molasses and ginger and the toasty warmth of corn, dense and comforting, almost always served warm with a melting scoop of vanilla ice cream or a pour of cold cream that ran into the dark pudding in pale rivers. In New England, it was an institution. Counters and old taverns kept it on the menu out of pure tradition, and regulars ordered it the way you'd visit an old friend. But Indian pudding asks for something the modern world ran out of: time, hours of slow baking, careful attention so the cornmeal doesn't go bitter or seize. No busy lunch counter speeding through a noon rush could justify a dessert that took half a day to make. As the old cooks left and the old taverns closed, the long, patient baking went with them. A dessert that had been on this continent for 300 years finally couldn't survive the stopwatch. Today it's a museum piece, and barely even that. The name means food of the gods, and at the mid-century lunch counter, ambrosia earned it. It was a glistening, snow-white mixture of fresh orange segments and crushed pineapple, bound in soft whipped cream and absolutely buried in shredded coconut, sometimes with maraschino cherries, sometimes a handful of tiny marshmallows, served ice-cold in a tall glass. It lived in that strange, wonderful place between a fruit salad and a dessert, light enough to feel virtuous, sweet and creamy enough to feel like a treat. The cold citrus, the chewy coconut, the soft cream, the occasional pop of a cherry. It was bright and refreshing, and a little bit festive, the kind of thing that made an ordinary Tuesday lunch feel like a small occasion. Ambrosia had a particular hold on the American South, but it traveled everywhere the counters went. It was beautiful to look at through the glass case, all white and gold, and that visual appeal made it a perfect counterseller. It sold itself just by sitting there. So why did it fade? Tastes changed, and the whole genre of creamy, coconut-heavy ambrosia salads started to feel dated, lumped in with the much-mocked gelatin salads of the era, and quietly retired along with them. Younger diners wanted their fruit and their dessert kept separate. The shredded coconut, once a luxury, became unfashionable, and the food of the gods slipped down to the food of nobody, surviving now mostly as a faded memory at an old family reunion. Never, ever at a counter. Here's a dessert so simple it sounds like a snack, and so beloved that grown adults still get misty remembering it. A slice of dark, moist date nut bread, dense with chopped dates and walnuts, sweet and a little sticky, spread thick with cool cream cheese, and served right there at the counter on a small plate beside a cup of coffee. That was it. That was the whole thing. And it was perfect. The bread was almost more cake than bread, deeply flavored with the caramel sweetness of dates and the bite of toasted walnuts, with a tender crumb that came from steaming or slow baking. The cool, tangy cream cheese against the warm sweetness of the bread was the entire point, a contrast so good it didn't need anything else. It was an afternoon ritual for a whole generation of shoppers and office workers. You came in for coffee, you got a slice of date nut bread with cream cheese, you sat at the counter for 15 quiet minutes, and you went back to your day. Some counters even sold it in little cans, the bread baked right inside the can in its perfect round shape. It disappeared the way quiet things do, without drama. Dates fell out of fashion. The five-and-dime counters that built their afternoons around coffee and a slice closed one by one. Faster, flashier snacks took its place, and a humble, beloved ritual, bread, cheese, coffee, a stool, a moment of peace, simply ended, leaving behind only the people who still remember exactly how it tasted. Quick pause. If any of these are bringing a memory back, do me a favor and tell me in the comments which one your family ate, because these recipes survive only as long as someone still remembers them. Now, back to the counter, and it's about to get good. In New York City, ask anyone over 80 about the Charlotte Russe and watch their face change. This wasn't just a dessert, it was a moment, a piece of childhood sold for a few cents from counters and corner candy stores all over the city. A little round of sponge cake at the bottom, a tall swirl of real whipped cream piled high on top, a single maraschino cherry crowning it, all of it served in a special ruffled cardboard holder with a push-up bottom. That holder was the magic. You'd push the cardboard disc up from the bottom as you ate, the cake and cream rising to meet you, so you never had to dig for it. Kids would eat the cream first, then push up the soft, slightly soaked sponge at the end. It was sweet, light, cold, and gone too fast, and you wanted another immediately. The Charlotte Russe was deeply, specifically tied to a time and place. Working-class New York, the early to mid-20th century, when a nickel bought you a small, perfect joy on the walk home. The counters that sold them were part of the neighborhood's fabric. And when those neighborhoods changed, when the corner stores and five-and-dimes closed and the whole world sped up, the Charlotte Russe had nowhere left to live. It was too handmade, too fragile, too tied to that little cardboard cup nobody manufactured anymore. It didn't evolve. It didn't get a factory version. It simply ended, surviving now only in the fierce, specific memories of the people who pushed that cardboard up as children and have never tasted anything quite like it since. Picture a wide, shallow bowl of pale yellow vanilla custard, smooth, cool, glossy. and floating on top of it, like clouds on a still pond, soft white poached meringues, drizzled with thin threads of golden caramel. It was almost too pretty to eat. People ordered it just to look at it for a second first. The contrast was sublime. The islands were nothing but egg whites whipped to a cloud and gently poached until they set into soft, melting pillows. The sea beneath was a rich crème anglaise made from the leftover yolks, silky, vanilla-scented, cold. A spoonful got you both at once, the barely there meringue dissolving into the cool custard, the bittersweet caramel cutting through, light and rich at the same time, somehow. It came from the grand European tradition, and its presence on an American lunch counter was a small act of elegance, a fancy restaurant dessert offered to anyone with a quarter and a swivel stool. That democratic glamour was exactly its charm. But Floating Island was finicky and time-consuming. The custard could curdle in a heartbeat. The meringues had to be poached just so or they'd weep and collapse. It demanded a cook with patience and a steady hand, the very thing the accelerating counter kitchen could no longer spare. As skilled hands left and instant puddings flooded in, the islands sank for good. A dessert that brought a touch of the grand to ordinary afternoons quietly disappeared beneath the surface, and almost no one orders it, or knows it, today. Before limited time only, was a marketing trick. There was peppermint stick ice cream, and its arrival meant something. This was the soda fountain's seasonal treasure. Creamy white ice cream shot through with crushed bits of real peppermint candy, the kind of pink and white striped sticks you'd hang on a tree, melting into cool, minty, crunchy swirls. The flavor was unmistakable. Cold, sweet cream and that sharp, clean rush of peppermint, with little shards of candy that crackled and slowly dissolved as you ate. It tasted like the holidays in a single scoop, bracing and festive and pure. Counters served it in a dish, in a cone, or built into special holiday sundaes with hot fudge running over the top, the warm chocolate and the cold mint together, a combination kids dreamed about all year. That was the whole point. It was seasonal. You couldn't get it in July. It showed up around the holidays. The soda fountains made a small event of it, and its scarcity made it precious. Generations of children measured the approach of Christmas by the day peppermint stick ice cream reappeared in the case. The soda fountain's death was its death. As the drugstore counters and corner fountains were torn out through the 60s and 70s, the made-in-house seasonal flavors went with them. Mass-market freezers offered 100 flavors year-round, and the magic of a special, fleeting, only-now treat evaporated. A few brands still make a version at Christmas, but the experience, the counter, the ceremony of its return vanished forever. Some flavors belong so completely to a region that when the counters closed, they nearly took the flavor with them. The maple walnut sundae was New England and the Northeast in a dish. Rich vanilla ice cream, a generous pour of real maple syrup, the dark, robust, late-season kind, and a scatter of toasted walnuts, sometimes the whole thing built on maple walnut ice cream for a double dose. What set it apart was the realness. This wasn't pancake syrup. The good counters used actual maple, with its deep, woodsy, caramel-edged sweetness, and they toasted the walnuts so they were warm and bitter and crunchy against the cold cream. The combination was sophisticated and comforting at once. Sweet but earthy, a grown-up sundae that kids loved anyway. It was a point of regional pride, a way for a local counter to put its corner of the country right in the dish. In Maple Country, ordering one was practically a civic duty, and the quality of a counter's maple walnut said everything about whether you'd come back. Its decline came with the slow death of the soda fountain and the rise of cheap imitation flavorings. Real maple is expensive. Artificial maple flavoring is not, and it tastes like a lie. As fountains closed and the survivors cut costs, the genuine maple walnut sundae, real syrup, real toasted nuts, made to order, became rarer and rarer until it all but vanished outside a handful of stubborn old holdouts. The flavor that once defined a whole region faded to a memory most of the country never even shared. We're into the soda fountain's crown jewels now, and the cherry phosphate float is pure, lost magic. To understand it, you have to understand the phosphate. A fizzy fountain drink made with flavored syrup, soda water, and a few drops of acid phosphate, which gave it a sharp, tangy, almost sour edge that made the whole thing taste impossibly crisp and refreshing. Add cherry syrup, and then drop in a scoop of vanilla ice cream, and you had the cherry phosphate float. It came in a tall, fluted glass, the cherry red soda foaming up around the melting white ice cream, a long spoon, and a paper straw stuck in the top. The first sip was bright, fizzy, tart sweet cherry. Then the ice cream melted into it, turning the whole thing creamy and soft and pink. Cold, sharp, sweet, and alive on the tongue in a way no modern soda can touch. The phosphate was the soul of the old soda fountain. That little drop of acid was the secret that made fountain drinks taste different and better than anything from a bottle. The soda jerk who made yours was a craftsman, pulling syrups and working the taps with a showman's flourish. When the soda fountains were ripped out and replaced by self-serve machines and canned soda, the phosphate died with them. The acid phosphate vanished from shelves. The skill of the soda jerk became obsolete, and a drink that fizzed and foamed at the center of American social life, where teenagers fell in love over a shared straw, disappeared so thoroughly that most people today have never even heard the word phosphate. Close your eyes and you can almost hear it, the metal cup ringing under the malt machine, the spindle whirring, the thick chocolate malted being poured into a tall glass with the extra still waiting in the frosty cup beside it. The chocolate malt was the undisputed king of the soda fountain, and its loss is the loss of an entire ritual. It started with ice cream, chocolate syrup, milk, and the crucial ingredient, malted milk powder, which gave it that deep, toasty, slightly nutty flavor and a richness a plain milkshake could never reach. Blended thick and cold, it was poured into a glass, and the steel mixing cup with the leftover was set down right next to it, so you got a glass and a half. That overflow cup was a small, perfect generosity that made you feel taken care of. It was the centerpiece of teenage life in the 40s and 50s. 2 straws, 1 malt, a booth or a counter stool, the jukebox playing. It wasn't just a drink, it was the prop of an entire culture, the thing in everyone's hand in every memory of those years. The malt itself faded as the fountains closed, and tastes shifted toward thinner, sweeter, faster drinks. Malted milk powder disappeared from most counters. The hand-blended malt with the extra in the metal cup gave way to machine-pumped soft serve and pre-mixed shakes that skipped the malt entirely. The flavor that defined a generation's youth thinned out, sped up, and finally vanished, leaving the ringing of that metal cup only in the memories of the people who once shared one across a straw. When summer came and the ovens felt unbearable, the lunch counter reached for the icebox, and the lemon icebox pie was the cool, tart queen of the season. No baking required, a crust of crushed graham crackers pressed into a pan, a filling of sweetened condensed milk, whipped with fresh lemon juice and egg yolks until it set up thick and silky in the cold, topped with a cloud of meringue or whipped cream and chilled until firm. The magic was the chemistry. The acid in the lemon juice actually thickened the condensed milk without any heat at all, setting it into a dense, creamy, intensely lemony filling that was tart and sweet in perfect balance. Cold from the icebox, against that sandy graham crust, it was the most refreshing thing on the menu. The dessert you craved when the day was hot and sticky, the dessert you craved when the day was hot and sticky, and you wanted something that bit back. It was a Southern favorite that spread nationwide precisely because it was so easy and so forgiving, and because it solved the summer problem. How do you serve pie when no one wants to light an oven? Refrigeration is what made it, and oddly, refrigeration is part of what unmade it. As home freezers filled with mass-produced frozen pies and cheesecakes, and as counters closed, the made fresh that morning lemon icebox pie lost its place. The store-bought versions were sweeter, gummier, full of artificial lemon. The real thing, 3 ingredients, fresh juice, set by chemistry alone, became a rarity, then a memory, then a recipe yellowing in a drawer. If lemon icebox pie was the tart queen of summer, strawberry icebox pie was her sweeter, blushing sister. And at the counter, the two of them ruled the warm months together. This was the no-bake pie at its most beautiful. A graham or shortbread crust, a cool, creamy filling, and fresh summer strawberries, layered through and piled on top. The whole thing set in the icebox, until it sliced clean and stood tall on the plate. There were as many versions as there were counters. Some folded crushed strawberries right into a sweetened cream cheese or condensed milk filling, turning it the softest pink. Some kept the filling pale and vanilla creamy, and crowned it with a glossy ring of glazed whole berries. Either way, the appeal was the same: cold, light, fruity, and absolutely tied to the few precious weeks when strawberries were ripe and cheap and everywhere. That seasonality was its glory. A strawberry icebox pie in June meant something. It was the taste of the year turning warm, summer arriving on a fork. Counters would put a whole pink pie in the case, and it would be gone by mid-afternoon. What killed it was the year-round grocery store. When strawberries became available frozen and shipped in every month of the year, the special magic of the summer-only pie evaporated. Mass-produced frozen versions, gluey, oversweet, made with berries that tasted of nothing, took the name and threw away the soul. The fresh, made-that-morning counter pie, built around fruit at its fleeting peak, slipped quietly out of season one last time and never came back. Reached the showstoppers, the pies that drew people in off the street just by sitting in the window. Coconut cream pie was the most seductive of them all. A flaky crust, a thick layer of rich coconut custard studded with shredded coconut, and on top, instead of plain whipped cream, a tall crown of meringue run under the broiler until its peaks turned a beautiful toasted gold, with little flecks of coconut caramelized on the surface. That broiled meringue was the whole drama, not a soft white cap, but a sculpted, swooping, golden-tipped cloud, the tips just burnt and slightly crisp, giving way to a marshmallowy softness underneath, then the cool, dense, coconut-rich custard below. 3 textures, hot from the broiler theater, and a flavor that was pure tropical comfort. It was the pie people pointed at through the glass. Pies like this were the lunch counter's pride, the centerpiece of the case, turned slowly, so every angle caught the light. A good counter's coconut cream was its reputation. Regulars had opinions. People came back specifically for it. But a proper coconut cream pie with broiled meringue is a serious piece of work. A cooked custard that can break, a meringue that can weep, a broiling step that's all timing and nerve. As scratch baking left the counter, and frozen, pre-made pies with stiff fake cream toppings rolled in, the real thing became too slow and too skilled to survive. The toasted meringue masterpiece in the window gave way to a sweating, frozen wedge from a box, and the pie that once stopped people on the sidewalk faded out of living memory. Of all the pies on this list, banana cream is the one people remember most fiercely and miss most deeply. A crisp, flaky crust, a layer of fresh sliced ripe bananas, a thick blanket of cool vanilla pastry cream binding them, and a high cap of whipped cream on top, sometimes with a few banana slices fanned across the surface and a dusting of crumbs or chocolate shavings. What made the counter version unforgettable was that everything was real and made that day. The pastry cream was cooked from scratch. Egg yolks, milk, sugar, vanilla, stirred until thick and glossy and cooled until silky. The bananas were sliced fresh, at the peak of ripeness, so they were sweet and soft and fragrant, melting into the cream. And the whipped cream was actual whipped cream, soft and barely sweet. Together it was the gentlest, most comforting dessert imaginable. Cool, creamy, mellow, like a hug on a plate. It was a counter-institution, often the most popular pie in the case, the safe and beloved choice for everyone, from truck drivers to school kids to old couples sharing a slice. It asked nothing of you and gave back everything, and it became one of the most counterfeited desserts in America. The version most people know now is instant banana pudding mix, that bright, artificial, slightly chemical banana flavor piled into a shell. It bears almost no resemblance to the real thing. The fresh fruit, the hand-cooked vanilla cream, the made-this-morning whipped topping. As scratch kitchens vanished, so did the genuine article. Most people today have only tasted the imitation and don't even know what they've been missing. It's called a pie, but it's a cake, and that little contradiction is half of why people love it and half of why it confuses everyone who's never seen one. Boston cream pie is 2 layers of golden sponge cake, filled with a thick band of rich vanilla custard and topped with a smooth, glossy sheet of dark chocolate that drips just slightly down the sides. At the lunch counter, a slice of it under glass was practically irresistible. That mirror shine of chocolate catching the light, the pale stripe of custard peeking out from the middle, begging you to point and say, "That one." The name comes from the old days when cakes and pies were baked in the same round tin pans, and the words were used interchangeably. There was no contradiction at all back then, just a cake baked in a pie pan. What matters is the eating, the tender, buttery sponge, the cool, vanilla-rich custard oozing from the center, and the bittersweet snap of the chocolate glaze on top. 3 distinct, perfect things in one forkful: cake, cream, and chocolate, each holding its own, and each better for the company of the other 2. It has genuine, traceable history. It goes back to a grand Boston hotel in the 1850s, where a French chef first crowned the custard-filled cake with a chocolate glaze, and it became so beloved that more than a century later it was named the official dessert of the entire state. But by the 1950s it had long since trickled down from the marble lobbies and white tablecloths to the everyday counter, where a factory worker or a school teacher could have a slice of that hotel elegance for pocket change, eaten off a chipped plate on a swivel stool with a cup of black coffee beside it. That was the quiet miracle of the lunch counter. It took the fine things and handed them to everybody. Boston cream pie hasn't vanished as completely as some on this list, but the real one has, and that's the part people don't realize. The counter version was made entirely from scratch, a true egg foam sponge baked that morning, a custard cooked slow on the stove and stirred by hand until it thickened, a chocolate ganache poured warm so it set to a soft shine. What replaced it is the boxed snack cake in cellophane and the gas station wedge sweating under a plastic dome, spongy, oversweet, filled with a shelf-stable yellow goo that has never met an egg. The handmade slice, with its delicate cooked custard and its just-set chocolate, the one that sat proudly in the counter case and disappeared by mid-afternoon, has quietly slipped away while keeping its famous name, so most people think they've had it, when what they've actually tasted is its ghost. There may be no dessert more photogenic, more triumphant, more pure fun than a pineapple upside-down cake done right, and the lunch counter version was a small spectacle every single time. The cake was baked with the topping on the bottom, golden rings of pineapple and bright red maraschino cherries, arranged with care in a pan slicked with melted butter and brown sugar, the batter poured over the top. And then, the magic moment everyone waited for, the whole thing flipped over after baking, so the hidden fruit became a glistening caramelized crown, sitting proudly on top. When it came out of the oven and was turned over onto the plate, the brown sugar and butter had melted down into the pineapple to form a sticky, dark gold caramel glaze, the cherries shining like polished jewels in the center of each ring. The cake underneath had soaked up all that buttery syrup as it baked, so it went moist and dense and tender, the edges almost candied where they'd met the hot sugar. Served by the slice at the counter, often still slightly warm, so the glaze was soft and the smell of caramelized pineapple hung in the air. It was sweet, sticky, fruity, and impossibly cheerful. A dessert that made an ordinary Tuesday lunch feel like somebody's birthday. It became a genuine sensation in the mid-century American kitchen, helped along by the canning companies who printed the recipe right on the label, and it was a natural fit for the counter, where its bold, colorful, glossy top made it the undisputed star of the dessert case. It practically glowed under the lights. It didn't need a sign or a sales pitch. It sold on looks alone, drawing eyes and orders from across the room. For a lot of people, it was the first fancy cake they ever tasted, and the sight of it flipping out of the pan was a memory all on its own. Its slow fade came as scratch baking gave way to convenience, and as the canned pineapple and maraschino cherries that once felt so modern and glamorous came, decades later, to feel dated and artificial. The very symbols of an old-fashioned kitchen people wanted to leave behind. The flipped from the pan, made fresh, still warm version, caramelized and a little messy and absolutely wonderful, quietly replaced by sad, dry, mass-produced squares wrapped in plastic. The cherries faded to a dull pink, the glaze gone gummy. The cake that used to draw actual gasps when it was turned over in front of you became just another relic of a more cheerful, more handmade time, remembered fondly, made almost never. You think the hot fudge sundae still exists. The one they made at the lunch counter, the real one, has all but vanished, and the difference between then and now would genuinely break your heart. This was vanilla ice cream in a tall, fluted glass or a heavy-footed silver dish, drowned in genuine hot fudge, thick, dark, glossy, made in-house from real chocolate and butter and cream, kept warm in a pot all day so it poured slow and heavy, and then set against the cold ice cream into a chewy, taffy-like ribbon you had to work loose with your spoon. Then a tall swirl of real whipped cream, a scatter of toasted nuts, and a single bright cherry balanced on top. That hot fudge was everything. It was the whole reason the dessert had a name worth saying. Not chocolate syrup, not the thin, watery fudge topping from a squeeze bottle that runs right off and pools at the bottom. This was actual cooked fudge, simmered from real chocolate until it was so thick the spoon stood straight up in the pot, with a deep, bittersweet, almost grown-up chocolate intensity that turned chewy and stretchy and taffy-like the instant it touched the frozen cream. The contrast was the entire genius of the thing. Warm against cold, bitter against sweet. That soft, chewy fudge against the hard, clean snap of the ice cream. Every counter and fountain guarded its own fudge recipe like a family secret, and a great one was a point of fierce local pride. People chose which counter to walk into based on whose hot fudge was better, and they were loyal. The hot fudge sundae was the soda fountain's grand finale, the celebration dessert, the one you ordered for a birthday, a first date, a report card with good marks, or simply a day that had gone right and deserved marking. The soda jerk built it in front of you like a small performance. The scoop, the slow pour of dark fudge, the cream, the nuts, the cherry placed just so, and then slid it across the counter with a flourish, while you watched the whole thing happen at eye level, close enough to smell the warm chocolate. What's left today wears the exact same name and almost none of the soul. Pumped chocolate sauce from a pouch, aerosol cream that hisses out and collapses in a minute, a pale machine cherry. The slow-cooked, kept warm, made from real chocolate hot fudge, the kind that's set into chew a pumped chocolate sauce from a pouch, aerosol cream that hisses out and collapses in a minute, a pale machine cherry. The slow-cooked, kept warm, made from real chocolate hot fudge, the kind that set into chew against the cold and made you scrape the glass for the last of it, disappeared right along with the fountains and the craftsmen who stirred it. The sundae survived in name on 1,000 menus. The real thing, the one worth remembering, quietly did not. And here it is, the single most spectacular dessert ever to come across an American lunch counter, the one they carried out and set before you like a prize, and in its grandest form, lit on fire, right there in front of your eyes. Baked Alaska was a magic trick you could eat, a base layer of cake, a tall dome of hard frozen ice cream piled on top of it, the whole thing sealed completely under a thick, swooping blanket of meringue, and then, impossibly, against everything your common sense told you, slid into a blazing hot oven or hit with a torch until the meringue browned and toasted, while the ice cream sealed inside stayed frozen rock solid. That was the miracle that made the whole counter turn and look. How on earth do you bake ice cream without it melting into soup? The answer was the meringue itself. That thick layer of whipped egg white is full of air, and air is a near-perfect insulator, so the outer shell could brown and caramelize in the few seconds of fierce heat, while the ice cream beneath never had time to feel it. Cut down into it with your spoon, and you passed through 3 worlds in a single bite. Warm, golden, faintly crisp meringue on the outside, then cold, dense ice cream in the middle, then soft cake at the bottom catching the melt. Hot and frozen at once, on the same spoon, which still sounds like a lie until you've tasted it. And in the fanciest fountains and the better counters, they'd pour warmed liqueur over the top, and touch a match to it, and for a few seconds the whole thing was wrapped in a flickering curtain of pale blue flame, while everyone nearby stopped eating to watch. It was the showstopper to end all showstoppers, the dessert you ordered to celebrate something real, to impress a date, to mark a night you wanted to remember for the rest of your life. Even on an ordinary swivel stool under fluorescent light, with a paper napkin and a glass of ice water, the arrival of a baked Alaska brought a flash of pure theater into the middle of an average day. It made regular people feel, for a moment, like they were somewhere grand. That was its whole gift. And theater is exactly what the speeding, cost-cutting, desk-killed counter eventually could no longer afford to give. Baked Alaska demands timing, nerve, and a real cook's steady hand. The meringue has to be whipped just right and sealed with no gaps. The heat has to be fast and ferocious, and one wrong move, one extra moment, and you've got a melting puddle and a ruined plate in front of a watching customer. As the old craftsmen retired, and the fountains were torn out, and the kitchens were handed over to machines and stopwatches, the fire simply went out. Today, almost no one has seen one made the old way, flames and all. Most people have never seen one at all. The grandest, most theatrical, most joyful dessert America ever served from a humble 5-and-dime counter became the rarest thing on the menu, and then nothing at all, a piece of edible magic that vanished completely, taking its blue fire and its gasps and its sense of occasion with it. 30 desserts, 30 small worlds of flavor that millions of people once knew by heart, and that almost no one alive can still taste, because the counters closed, the cooks passed on, and the recipes went into the trash with the rest of an era. They didn't disappear because they weren't good enough. They disappeared because the world got faster, and nobody stopped to write them down. But you just did something about that. Every one of these survives a little longer now, simply because you remembered it for the length of this video. So tell me in the comments, which one did your family eat? Which one just brought a face, a place, a Saturday afternoon rushing back? If this brought the old counter back to life for you, there's a whole lost world of forgotten food still waiting, and we're going to bring all of it back, one vanished recipe at a time. Thanks for sitting at the counter with me. I'll see you at the next one.